Are you being told the truth, or is their version of the truth being told to you?
You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but this is the Boys on the Tracks case. This one is a black hole of conspiracies having to do with their murder, and it's a case that's going to make you angry. I almost guarantee it. The stuff that went on in this case is just mind-blowing, and the fact that 31 years later it's still not solved will get your blood boiling even more. And it's rarely talked about in the media as well. It took me so much to find information on this case, and in fact took a podcast that I found that I will link down below where I got most of this information because they did so well in finding it and digging so deep that I want to give them a shout out for that. It's True Crime Garage. But this case deserves to be heard, so pay attention and listen closely, because afterwards you will want to share this information as far as you possibly can. By the way, if you are a fan of true crime, then please make sure to subscribe and give these videos a thumbs up, or share them around, or share these cases around so I can continue sharing these people's stories. Now let's get back to the story. So it was August 23rd of 1987 when a 6,000-ton cargo train was headed down the railroad tracks. They were going to Little Rock, Arkansas, but they were not yet there. They were actually near Bryant, Arkansas, about 20 miles from their destination. Engineer Stephen Schroyer was guiding the train. It was a mile-long train, 52 miles an hour. He was guiding it down the railroad tracks when all of a sudden he attempted to stop the train completely. He had seen a dark spot on the tracks from a little while back, but he couldn't necessarily tell what it was. But once he got close enough to see what it was too late to waste any time, because he saw two boys lying across the railroad tracks. By the time he pulled the emergency stop, the train went a half a mile trying to stop, screeching and screaming, going down these railroad tracks with the weight of the heavy cargo carrying it forward. When it finally came to a stop, the conductor called over the radio. His name was Jerry Tomlin, and he called to the train on the parallel tracks that was approaching that they also needed to stop and begin stopping early because there had been an accident. He also called the dispatcher. The dispatcher then asked, "Have you got any injuries?" And Jerry replied, "No, we've got death. I'm sure we've got death. They passed under us. It has to be death." They had placed the train in an emergency position and they blew the horn, but it was only about 3 to 5 seconds till impact. And they said that doesn't seem like much time when you think about it, but when you're bearing down on a couple of children, it feels like an eternity. It was 4 a.m. on that Sunday, and they had just been doing their jobs when they spotted the dark spot, and then they saw a flash of light, which was thought to be something metal that was reflecting back from the train's headlights. But they noticed far too late that they were actually humans. The train was only 100 feet away when the engineer yelled, "Oh my God," because he noticed the boys, and he saw that there was a rifle lying next to one of them, pointed at their head. They also saw what was thought to be a tarp of some sort laying on the lower half of their body from their waist to their knees. It looked like either a green, pale tarp or a boat cover. And they were wedged in there with their heads against the west rail, wedged against each other, looking up. They had watched the train go over the boys and heard the impact, and they said it was almost like a 1, 2, 3, with 1 and 2 being the boys and the third one being the gun. When they finally came to a stop, they got off and they searched for the boys with flashlights, and they found the lower half of their bodies outside of the train tracks and the upper half inside. The first boy's head and chest were the parts that were the most intact, but the second boy wasn't so lucky, and body parts were all over the place from up to a quarter mile away. When the police finally got there at 4:40 a.m., they noticed the lack of blood in the area from what they assumed they were going to walk into. It was not reddish blood, and the blood they did find was almost a dark purple. The body parts almost resembled mannequin parts, and although this was strange and there was strange evidence, the police almost immediately ruled it a suicide or an accidental death, even though the crew members were saying that they strongly disagreed. The parts were then taken to be identified by the dental records, and they were determined to be 16-year-old Don Henry and 17-year-old Kevin Ives. They were best friends of 6 months. They had recently become friends, but they were pretty popular at Bryant High School, and they were just typical teenage boys who liked to, work on their cars on the weekends, hang out with their girlfriends. Don was the comedian in the relationship, and Kevin was his supportive audience member who clapped and laughed anytime he needed support. And they were just the best of friends. But a week after the funerals were held, the state medical examiner came forward with their ruling on how they really died. He said that it was an accidental death and that they were under the influence of THC or marijuana. Not only that, but 20 joints of it, where they were under such a deep sleep from this psychedelic influence that they had fallen asleep on the tracks and didn't hear the train coming. The parents who had went to this ruling of the state medical examiner, when they walked in the room, the medical examiner named Fahmy Malik, he oddly took Polaroid pictures of them and then had them sign forms confirming that they were there and heard the ruling. But as soon as the parents disagreed with him, said that was not true because their boys didn't do drugs, or definitely didn't do that many drugs, he got really angry and didn't want to hear anything else. Kevin Ives' dad, Larry, who was also a railroad engineer at the time, came forward saying, "Well, I couldn't believe that Kevin was knocked out on marijuana or any kind of heavy drugs, anything like that, because I was at home a lot during the day. When Kevin comes in from school and Linda was here at night, and we never seen him in a state that he would even act like he was, spaced out, or however you want to phrase it." And I think that this hit Kevin Ives' father even more, if you can even possibly hit more than it being your son that has passed away. But he had actually worked on those exact railroad tracks that his son had died on. Just a few months prior, he had been on that route. Thankfully, if you could even say thankfully, his route was changed before that happened, because otherwise that could have been him who ran over his own son. When their parents went to go see the state medical examiner, they had actually brought evidence of their own. They had went down to where the railroad tracks were after all of this happened and kind of searched a little bit for themselves, and they had found a large piece of cardboard that was large enough to be able to drag 2 bodies through the woods, and it also had a stain on it. So when they went in, they really wanted to hand it over, but they were afraid to hand it just to their local law enforcement, and they knew that the state officers would be there during the ruling. So they handed it over to the state officer, and it was never seen again. Never tested, never talked about, and this is when the parents knew they needed to hire a private investigator. They also hired a second opinion of a different medical examiner to do the autopsies on their boys to figure out what really caused their death. But these results came back exactly the same with these 2 medical examiners. The odd thing was, though, the second one that they had just hired didn't yet have all the information when he came back saying that his ruling was the same. And when asked how he had already gotten that ruling, he said, "Well, I work at the same kind of lab as your first medical examiner, so we would probably get the same results anyway." So as you can tell, this private investigator had a lot of work on his hands to try to figure out what actually happened. He found that that night, the boys who would usually go on double dates with their girlfriends on the weekends actually decided to go to the commuter parking lot, which was like a local teenage hangout in the town. Every small town has one, and this was just where the teenagers would go to hang out. Now, around 12 a.m., about 4 hours before they were found, they actually left that little hanging out area, and they headed back to Don's house. Don's father, Curtis, said that Don came in the house around 12:15 and Kevin actually stayed outside. Don was coming in and he told his father they were going to go spotlighting, which is a form of hunting that is illegal in Arkansas, where you shine a spotlight in the animal's face before the other one shoots them and kills them, kind of like distracting them, like deer in the headlights type thing. And so he told his father this. His father said that he could use his spotlight, and Don grabbed his own gun, which was a .22 caliber rifle, and then headed outside to meet with Kevin again. Don's father said the reason that the other boy, Kevin, stayed outside was because the last time Kevin had stayed the night at Don's house, the boys had actually went missing. It wasn't that serious of a thing, but it seemed like it in the moment. You see, Don and his father had gotten in an argument while the boys were staying over there, and so they left that evening. Don's father figured that they went back to Kevin's house and wasn't too worried about it until he called Kevin's mom the next morning, and they weren't there either. Both of the parents were panicking, and then they realized that the boys had just went to go hang out at somebody else's house. So after that, Kevin's mother said that he couldn't go over there anymore. But on August 22nd, she finally came around and said that Kevin could. But Don's father said that he knew exactly where the boys were going that evening. They always went to the same spot. It was right behind Don's house. It was on the railroad tracks to hunt. And so he knew exactly where they were going. He had no problem with it. But then the next morning when he woke up at 5 a.m., they had disappeared. They weren't home yet. He had no idea where they were, and he just had such a bad feeling. So he decided to go out to look for them. And remember, this was about an hour after the boys had been found on the railroad tracks and 20 minutes after the police had got to the scene. Don's father, Curtis, was out searching. He actually came across a deputy, and he asked this deputy if he had seen two teenage boys. The deputy, who we don't know if he knew about the boys on the tracks yet or not, said that he hadn't, and when he asked for the names of the boys, Curtis didn't really want to give him Don and Kevin's names because they were doing something illegal. So he just didn't say anything and kept looking. But this deputy never said anything about the boys on the tracks. He went on looking, but he found nothing, and after a few hours, he decided to go ahead and call Kevin's parents to let them know, to ask if they knew anything, and they didn't. And so he just went on looking and got off the phone with them, but a few hours later, he called them back. He said that they needed to hurry over to his house because the boys had been tied to the railroad tracks, shot, and ran over. She thought he was kidding, but she went to the house anyways and saw Kevin's car, her son, in the driveway, and so she was just like, oh, this is a prank, this is stupid, but she was relieved at the same time. That is until a deputy came out to her car to get her. A neighbor had actually informed Don's parents that this had happened, and yet the news hadn't broke yet and the boys hadn't been identified yet. But the police came and kind of confirmed the neighbor's story because they had found a piece of evidence at the scene that linked these boys to the Henry family. This was a hat, a camouflage hat that had a Rock Electric logo on it, which was an electric company in the area that Don's father worked at as a superintendent. And Don had actually worked with his father there that summer and had a hat just like that. The next morning, the news broke all over the media, and people went out searching, and they found a severed foot in the gravel and also pieces of the gun. These people who were just searching for no reason, it wasn't a search party, they just came to gawk and to see what was happening. And this is what they found. But while the private investigator was trying to find out more information, he kept running into roadblocks because every time he would find something important, he would meet resistance from the authorities on finding anything out about that. And so he eventually just had to do things all by himself, and he had found something that was very odd, and quite a few oddities in this case actually. But one of them being that the conductor who had called the parallel train saying that they should stop, the train had stopped, but the officers had instructed it to go ahead and go forward before all of the body parts were even collected, contaminating the scene already. The train crew also said that the police officers were telling each other to treat the scene as a traffic accident, and they'd never even taped it off. Then the police officers were telling the crew that they didn't see a tarp at all, when all 4 members of the train crew had said that they had seen it and described it almost exactly the same. But the police officers were telling them that it didn't exist, and neither did the gun. The engineer of this train thought that this was like questioning the existence of the boys on the tracks. saying, "But because what's real is real and what's not is not," and it was there as well as the boys. Police also missed a small bag of pot that was found in Don's pants that were handed back to his family. All of his clothes were, and they found it that the police hadn't confiscated at all. But 2 days after the accident, the police came forward with a statement saying that they hadn't ruled anything out except for foul play. They did question people, friends and family, the community, for about a week. And in every single questioning, they asked 2 questions. How much drugs did the boys use, and were they suicidal? And it almost seemed like they were trying to create a narrative all of their own. Unable to find any truth 5 months after their children had died, they held a press conference, the parents did. And this was February of 1988, and they were doing this in hopes that the investigation would have to be reopened. And this worked because the day after, it was. Prosecutor Richard Garrett had actually just been appointed to office, and he knew really nothing of the case and definitely didn't know that these parents were unhappy with how the investigation ended. He had the boys' bodies exhumed for a second autopsy, well, technically a third one if you count that second one at all. But this time it was done by a doctor named Dr. Burton from Atlanta. So he would have a completely fresh view, an honest take, and he had more experience. One of the first things that he tested was a shirt that was found not on the body but away from the tracks that seemed to be Don's shirt. And that was because it had an identical tear or opening in the shirt that matched the one on Don's back. He wanted to test it to see if that cut came from a train or something else. He looked at it under a microscope and found that it had not been done by the dragging of the boys under the train. It had been done by a blade. And there was blood on the shirt. And on Kevin, a cut on his cheek was inconsistent to what the train could have done, and it almost looked like he had been hit with the butt end of a gun. Both of the boys also had fluid in their lungs that pointed to them already being dead or unconscious when the train hit. And the 20 joints that were said to be in their system turned out to only be between 1 and 3. But which examiner was correct? The first one or the third one? Dr. Malik or Dr. Burton? Well, Dr. Malik, the first medical examiner, was looked into a little bit more after these, and more of his autopsies and his rulings came out, and they were very fishy. One of them was of a man who had died in his apartment, and he had been left there a few days, and when they found him, he didn't have a head. Fahmy Malik ruled his death from being of an ulcer. Seemed very odd, and his thoughts were that this man had a dog, and this dog chewed off this head after he had died, and basically to eat it, and that was how he lost his head. But then the head was found, and there was a perfect cut right along his neck that a dog's mouth was not capable of doing. But he still believed that the dog had done it. A grand jury was then put together to reverse the original verdict and ruling of the accidental deaths or suicides as being definite homicides. But who did this and why? Police obviously then had to actually do an investigation, and they interviewed a man named Jeff Rhodes who said that there was a man the Wednesday before the boys were killed. They were killed on a Sunday. This would have been the Wednesday before. And this man had said that a man had wanted to buy cocaine from him that Wednesday. But he didn't have it, and so he actually gave him the contact of Dawn Henry because he knew he had connections. And in an interview with Dawn's sister Gayla, she said that the Thursday before they were murdered, she had known that her brother was at a drug dealer's house to purchase marijuana, and he had also been talking about the ultimate drug dealer. Gayla's husband said that Dawn had mentioned something about stealing cocaine, and a local classmate of theirs said that they were at a party in a mobile home that evening that they were murdered, and he heard them say something about selling cocaine. Another classmate eventually came forward named Keith Cooney, who was too scared to say anything that he wouldn't even tell his mother. He said that he was with them that night, the boys, and they were on somewhere called Shrobe Road in town, and they were smoking marijuana. Now Keith was on a motorcycle and the boys were walking, And he said that 2 officers then came up to them and Keith fled. But he was afraid that the officers had done something to the boys. Another man came forward unknowingly confirming this story, saying that he was out trying to catch his wife cheating when he saw 3 boys smoking marijuana. It was none of his business, but then he saw police come up to them. One of them fled, and then he saw the police officers beating the 2 remaining boys. He said they then threw them in the back of their cop car, and he believed that he knew who they were too. He believed they were police officers Jake Campbell and Kirk Lane. Another witness came forward confirming their stories, saying that he was headed home from Gigi's nightclub that night when he came across Shrub Road and he saw this unmarked police car and 2 boys with 2 officers off to the side. He said these officers were beating up these kids, and one had one shoved against a telephone booth, hitting him with what seemed to be the phone. He said he was afraid because he was drunk. He didn't want to get caught by this police car, so he kind of turned off his lights and he parked and he waited. While he waited around 2 to 2:30 a.m., the police officers shoved the boys into the car and had a rifle that they threw in as well, and then they headed down a dead-end road. He waited about 15 minutes, and then the police officers came back, but he couldn't tell if the boys were with them. Now, Keith Cooney, who was their friend that was supposedly with them that night, was actually supposed to testify at their grand jury because he had already come forward at this time. He was supposed to testify at their grand jury to make sure that their rulings for their deaths were changed to definite homicides. But before he could, he actually died in a motorcycle accident. Some believe that this wasn't an accident at all, but a car chase and a murder. But guess who examined his body after death? Dr. Malik. So nobody really knows what happened. Going along with that, a man named Greg Collins was also supposed to testify at this grand jury, and he was found dead as well. And he had been shot 3 times, 1 in the face. And Dr. Malik ruled his death as a suicide. But in 1993, a boy went to talk to Kevin's mother, Linda, after years of being begged to. You see, he was the boy's friends back then, but he was scared to come forward with what he had seen. You see, his name was Tom Newhouse, and he was out at the tracks that night with some other friends. He had seen 3 adult figures on the tracks and then 2 smaller looking figures approaching. Now, he couldn't really tell who any of them were at first, but then he heard the sound of a gunshot. In the flash of the light, saw a man he knew. He knew this man because his mother had been dating him, and his name was Dan Harmon. Dan Harmon was also a prosecutor and had been the prosecutor in the grand jury for these boys and was able to have free reign of all of the evidence in this case. Dan Harmon's mistress, Charlene Wilson, actually came forward in a grand jury of another trial saying that she often snorted cocaine with Dan and she knew about the night on the tracks. Dan was on trial for drug possession at this time. He'd actually been caught for that. And this is why it's thought that Charlene decided to come forward then, because she thought he was going to jail. But nonetheless, she said that she had met with Dan 2 other adults on the tracks that night, 2 other men. She said that they were agitated because they were kids who were trying to rip off their drug deal. She said 2 were brought back to them to be punished for what they had done, and they were Kevin and Dawn. She said one of them was already dead, and then another man on the scene killed the other one. She then later confessed that she was high at the time, and one of the men had told her to stab the living boy, and she had in the back. No one did anything with her statements, and this is when everything really comes together, because what if those police officers that were seen beating them up were working for Dan Harmon, this ultimate drug dealer? And what if they brought the boys back to him and one of them was already dead from the beating? There was another witness that came forward that also said that he had seen a man on the tracks wearing a military uniform about 200 yards away from the boys, where the boys were found, and a police officer a week before had seen a man in a military uniform there as well. The officer tried to stop and question the man, and he shot at him, and then that's when he lost the man. So there are so many leads in this case and so many witness statements, but no one has really ever been arrested. And that's what makes me so incredibly angry. From my research, I found that Charlene and Dan were both arrested on separate drug possession charges at some point after the boys' murder, but especially in Dan's case, nothing was looked into past like 1990, so it wouldn't have gone back to where the Boys on the Tracks murders were. They were never charged with the murder of the boys, and I don't even think it was looked into in their cases. It looked as though this case was going to be cold forever with no more information coming in, but that all changed this year, 2018. Because a man named William Albert Haynes came forward as a witness. But most people knew him as Billy Jack Haynes, as a wrestler for WrestleMania in 1987. He had apparently sobered up a few years ago and had been feeling guilty for years about what he had seen and finally confessed to Kevin's parents. He then agreed to go on a YouTube video to raise money to help the investigation continue. He said, "I come with no hidden voice. I come to you straight, face to face, because this is reality, man. Don't hide nothing." He said that while being in the WWE, he also trafficked and transported cocaine, which also led him to Arkansas. He said, "I was also an enforcer who provided muscle to other parts of the criminal element to ensure that their illegal business dealings were collected upon. In August of 1987, I was contacted by an Arkansas criminal politician and was asked if I would provide muscle at an Arkansas drug transaction." He said that this politician was suspicious that money was being stolen, and also that he witnessed the murders of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. In his words, they were murdered by other individuals who were working for the same criminal politician. Their bodies were placed on the railroad tracks to be mutilated by a passing train. "I'm standing here putting my life on the line telling you that I could very well be killed. They have to be taken down." He said he also named some of the individuals, well, most of them, who were at that crime scene for the investigators. He didn't in the video though, but I will link the whole video down below if you want to watch it. Although he is not known to be a huge credible source. Nobody knows how credible he really is. Some say that he has done so many drugs that his brain is fried. Some people say that, he couldn't make this stuff up. Some people have confirmed that he did dabble in trafficking and transporting drugs. So it's really unknown, and it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. It's not the best witness, but it's not the worst either. This was at the beginning of the year, around January, February, I think, and so far since then I can't see any more updates on this case. 31 years later, it remains unsolved. What do you think happened to these boys? Who do you think did it? This case has such a small spotlight on it, and all I could really find was bits and pieces other than that podcast that I was telling you about. It's really just like the bare minimum that people want to talk about because they don't want to get into, it could possibly be a police cover-up and all of that, but I think that that's important to get this investigation to still be going. It's not that there's a lack of evidence here, it's that there's so much that has been hidden. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down below, but please make sure to be respectful to these families because they are still living here. They are still trying to figure out answers, and they deserve that respect and the love from you and the support because they definitely need it. And I've seen some things that will say things about the boys being into the drugs and possibly into all of that. And I'm not going to judge them for that. I think that these were teenage boys who were murdered, and regardless of what they were doing, they didn't hurt anybody. And they didn't deserve to be hurt like that. And so I definitely do not want to hear any of those kind of comments down below. Please be respectful. These are two 16 and 17-year-old boys who had their lives taken from them. It was also found that 3 years before Kevin and Dawn's murders, 2 more young men were found dead on railroad tracks. It was 26-year-old Billy Don Hanline and 21-year-old Dennis Decker, and they had been run over in almost identical positions on the train tracks in Hodgen, Oklahoma. No suspects were found in this case, and their deaths were ruled accidental, but their family believes that they were murdered. Do you think that they're connected to Dawn and Kevin's murders in 1987? I'd love to hear all of your theories down below, because like I said, this is one huge conspiracy theory of a case, and it blows my mind that it's not more talked about. I couldn't really even find any true crime YouTubers who had talked about it, so I definitely want to share this as far as I possibly can. And just a reminder that I never do any of these cases with ill intentions. I really try to do my best research. I do try to do it just to give spotlight to the victims, and I hope that that shows in my videos. If you enjoy my content, or if you think that I do it respectively or anything like that, I would love your support, and all you have to do is subscribe, thumbs up, share my channel, because I appreciate that so much. So yeah, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.
How many people in power have to mess up before we realize that it matters who we give power to?